Yeah, right. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the history of the internet and of the personal computer, just a little bit. And this is, I think, a fascinating topic. And we have to go to start. This one is, the story can really begin in about 1968, 1970. But we have to do a little bit of background on that. So I want to take you back basically to the Second World War, because the first electronic computers are being introduced at that time. Now, the first mechanical computers have a long history, and those, some people would say, the Atari mechanism that was used for astronomical calculations in the Roman period is an example. But more recently, in the kind of 20th century, what inspired the mechanical computer was actually gunfire control for warships. And large, like battleships and things like this, needed ways to control the accuracy of their gunfire at long ranges. And so these companies were developing, like Vickers Armstrong and Whitworth and other companies, were developing machines that could take input from range-finding devices, which are basically big binoculars, and then compute the offset and the angle of attack and so on that is needed for the guns to hit their targets, for shells to be fired at their targets. And that process continued from the First World War. It actually started before the First World War, but it continued through the First World War, through the Interwar period, and into the Second World War, and was modified by radar gunfire control. As radar was introduced, the Americans were at the forefront of this, as were the British, and they began to develop electronic versions of their previously mechanical range-finding computers. Now, so one of the first examples of a electronic computational device, of course, is the bomb. That is the Colossus computer that was developed at Bletchley Park by Alan Turing. I have here the Benedict Cumberbatch cover version from the recent Oscar award-winning film about that subject. Of course, what Turing was doing there was developing an electronic computer that could solve crack the cryptography on German Enigma machines for the purposes of submarine warfare, really. But the Enigma was used for the purposes the Luftwaffe had a version, and so which was I think the British had already solved that one, and so they were having more trouble with the naval one because they couldn't get hold of the machines. The machines were hard to get hold of. The Norwegian campaign in that regard was very important. At any rate, so the British during the war, and the Americans, because they were doing the same thing with their magic system, I believe it was, were trying to get access to, trying to solve the enemy's cryptography, essentially. And so electronic computers provided a big advantage in that regard. Now, as the computers became more powerful, they introduced programming languages for those computers. Now, of course, these things were binaries. They could, those on-off calculations, and the device that was used to make the on-off, the binary system work was, I believe, vacuum tubes. And so these were either, charged or uncharged, right? But, and this is where the story gets interesting after the war, is a bunch of agencies are set up during the Eisenhower administration, primarily during what's called the Pentomic Age, to expand the technical capacity of the United States military and the Defense Department, in the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. So, of course, the Sputnik launch by the Russians scares the Americans, and they need to catch up, they feel. And so Eisenhower introduces NASA, for one, and then he introduces DARPA, or what's called ARPA, the Advanced Research Project Agency at the time. And these are supposed to do radical thinking and advanced technology to catch up with the Soviet Union and to make sure the Americans maintain a technological edge, which of course they're still obsessed with today. At any rate, so what both of those organizations do, and I think this is very significant, is they start developing networks. So now things like telephone exchanges had existed for really since the introduction of the telephone in the early, at the end of the 19th century and the 20th century. So during the First World War, the British developed a fairly sophisticated telephone exchange system in London, specifically to deal with Zeppelin attacks, because they needed to be able to contact air bases, to scramble fighters to go try to confront the Zeppelins. They needed a very efficient telephone exchange system for that purpose. That again was expanded during the Battle of Britain in the Second World War. So the that network of telephone exchanges had kind of gone into place, and telephone lines were being run over the world, expanding really on what had been happening again during the 19th century with the telegraph. So nothing and nothing new there. And then the other side of that is wireless telegraphy, which is radio, had been introduced, and that leads up to radar, as I was mentioning earlier. At any rate, so those networks are already in place. Now, but what ARPA and NASA are doing, and then the United States Air Force, this makes sense, of course, is because of the fear of nuclear attack, they need to have robust communication networks where they can exchange information in a way that's secure and will be distributed. So NASA, of course, develops one for the space program, and so this is to communicate between their launch facilities in Florida, the Cape Canaveral, and at their operations center in Houston. And so they have those are then connected to computers, these big clunky industrial-sized computers that are built by companies like IBM and so on. And ARPA is doing the same thing with their systems. Now, so where the story really gets going, where I'm really interested in taking the story to kind of get underway here, is with this, what's called the mother of all demos, that Doug Engelbert and Bob English do at SRI's, at Stanford Research Institute, in 1968. And this is really interesting because what they're funded by, not surprisingly, ARPA, NASA, and the United States Air Force. And what they do is they build at the time it cost $100,000, so today this would cost millions of dollars, but they build a prototype of basically every system that ultimately gets integrated into the personal computer and the internet. So for example, they develop, this is 1968, they demo, this mother of all demos, they demo the mouse. Engelbert has developed this. They have a simple database system in the demo. They also have a video over a communication line. They demo. They show you can do network video. So a lot of things get introduced with that mother of all demos by Engelbert and English. Now the important thing about this, though, is the concept, the design element of this, because what Engelbert was and English, but what they were really interested in here was what they called human adaptation. So this was about creating a working environment for the future workers in the technology sectors that would be kind of relaxed and ergonomic, and you'd be able to lay back and sit back, and you'd have your computer there, right, and you could interface with it, and that would expand. It would expand, like in a transhumanist way, it would expand your human capacities by giving you access to the information storage and these networks and so on. And this coincided. Now they had been preceded a little bit because they needed, of course, there's serious technologies they needed to make this happen. So they needed a programming language that worked, and they needed the computer infrastructure to some extent. Now, so the key guys working on that were Noyce and Moore. Now, Moore, of course, was Moore's Law. Robert Noyce is the guy who was at Fairchild Semiconductors, and he went and founded Intel in Silicon Valley. So he's considered kind of the founder of Silicon Valley in 1964. And what Intel is doing is making the microchip and the transistor, and that is so crucial because it gets away from that vacuum tube era that we were talking about earlier, and into this. Now you can make the computers a lot smaller, they can be a lot more effective, and you can start thinking about what Engelbert English started doing with them, which is let's put them on your desk. You can have a working environment there, not just typewriters and clunky junk like that. So the infrastructure is being developed by these companies in Silicon Valley that are being founded there. And this fits with SRI, Stanford Research Institute. So a lot of this is happening at Stanford, but it's not just there. It's also happening at MIT, and in the UK. There's schools working on it there. The University of London is working on this as well. So it's kind of happening around the world. But the popular version of this, really, and it's fair to say, is happening at Silicon Valley. Now, so one of the books that I want to reference to you in that regard is Adam Fisher's book. This came out fairly recently. It's called The Valley of Genius, Uncensored History of Silicon Valley. And this is an excellent, outstanding compilation of stories and interviews, really, that some that he conducted, but others that he culled from old journal articles and like Rolling Stone magazines and stuff like that, and Wired and what have you. And what he goes right back to the beginning, and he talks about Engelbert English, and he goes on to the founding of Intel and Xerox. He talks about, which I'll get to in just a minute, and then Apple computers and so on. And so that's an excellent resource in that regard. Now, okay, so yeah, now in 1969, so the Motorola demo is 1968, but in 1969, ARPANET is created by the Advanced Product Research Agency. And so ARPANET, like I said, this is a precursor to the internet, and it's a regionalized one. In the same way that the Apollo program, the Moonlight program, they were using a net that NASA had developed. So what you see here happening is the networks are being evolved to connect to the personal computers, and that that are being developed by Engelbert English. Now, 1972, Atari comes along, and this is one of the things that's covered quite extensively in Adam Fisher here. But Atari is important because what they do is they take the television, and they connect that with a system that allows you to interface with it. Now, it's for computer gaming, of course, and arcade gaming and what have you. They become very successful in that regard. But they also do a lot of really interesting research on weird projects. Like they're interested in VR, and they're trying to like expand into these other areas. And so they're making a lot of money on these video games, but they're also trying to do other research, which is a big research and development, of course, is a huge component of this, and that's a classic aspect of all the work that is happening in Silicon Valley. So, yes, now, Atari leads directly into the next phase, which is the development of the Altair. Now, the Altair, this is a very rudimentary computer, but it's 1974 here it's released, but it can be used, and these are called microcomputers, and they can be used by engineers in research labs or just kind of at home, what have you, and you can program them using BASIC. So, which is, I believe, let's see here. Yes, well, IBM, no, I want to say Microsoft is one of the first things that they do. It's one of the first things that Bill Gates works on, is the programming language for the Altair. So again, this is a very rudimentary computer system. The point simply is that it's now becoming accessible, and what you have is people taking their Altairs and kind of hacking them. They take them to these conventions, and where they have the home computing conventions and the homebrew computing, and so it's getting. You can see that the dissemination is starting to happen here from these big industrial defense department networks and space program agencies and so on, down to the individual and like the universities, right? And so there's a research element, but it's becoming a consumer technology. Okay, so in also in 1974, I think 1975, Bell Labs is formed. Bell, of course, telephone network, and they are also working on their own kind of version of the internet. 1977, Bob Taylor is working at PARC and for Xerox. Now, this is really significant. This is the agency that Xerox sets up to do advanced research. Again, going back to the theme of research, so important because what PARC creates. Now, Xerox machines, they're making these photocopiers, right? And they're big, clunky machines, but they're used, in offices, and they're very successful in that regard. But what they are doing, as you know, is they're starting to make interfaces for their Xerox machines. And so one of the things they actually develop is a graphic user interface. And you'll see anytime you use a Xerox machine, right? There's like a little interface for that. So they had developed that long before anybody else had really thought this up, except Engelbert English. I'd say they were doing it in 1968. So this was 10 years later. But the point with Xerox was that they were going to bring the price down and the technology down, and it was much more accessible now. And so a bunch of people went to Xerox PARC. Now the problem with this is an infamous story, the Xerox PARC story, because the corporate Xerox didn't understand what PARC was doing. Like, who are these guys? Bob Taylor is doing this radical work out there, but is this really? Do we need this? Like, he's making these graphic user interfaces. What's this about? However, some guys did catch on to this. One of them was Steve Jobs, and so they picked this up and they brought it back and started using it in their technology. And now the watershed. Well, there's a couple things that happened in the meantime. The Apple II is released. Wozniak, very important in that regard. Oracle is founded. Ellison, right? Now, but in 1981, IBM releases the PC. And that's huge. And of course, they contract Microsoft to make DOS for it. And this is enormous because they make the first computer, personal computer that you can go out and buy off the shelf, and it's fairly affordable, and that and they know that this is going to be in everybody's office and so on. So the IBM PC in 1981, a huge development. Then there's a swath of copycats that follow. Dell is founded, Silicon Graphics is founded, that's Jim Clark's company, Sun Microsystems is founded, and then in 1984, the Macintosh is released by Apple Computers. William Gibson writes Neuromancer, okay? So you can see in the mid-'80s, these are developments that have come out of the 1970s, but in the mid-'80s, this technology is now coming to, I mean, it's matured, it's coming to fruition, and it's going to be used by a lot of these corporate, kind of up-and-coming, revolutionary corporate technologists who want to get their slice of the pie. And so a great book in that regard is this one by Robert Kingsley. This is a pseudonym. The book is called Accidental Empires, and it's about the early history of IBM PC and of Apple and Silicon Graphics and all those companies. And of course, yes, it's the basis for Triumph of the Nerds, if you've ever seen that 3-part documentary series, Triumph of the Nerds, which Kingsley himself narrates. Quite interesting look at the era. Highly recommend that one by PBS. Okay, so mid-'80s, we've now seen that the personal computer it's here to stay. It's being designed so that it fits with these kind of classical Engelbert English design characteristics about ergonomics, and they're not so interested in user friendliness, but that's becoming a big thing now with the graphic user interface and Windows and I mean, not always, no, Windows hasn't been released yet, but the Apple Macintosh does have a graphic user interface based on the Xerox PARC technology. At the same time, IBM starts working on OS/2, right? And this is going to be their answer to what Apple is doing, and it's going to replace DOS. AOL is introduced. Nintendo is built. Now the Whole Earth catalog develops their first UBB system, which is the IRC chat, called the Whole Earth Wellness Link, or WELL. Unix operating systems are now widely available. And so you can see it, like I say, with like AOL and WELL, you've got the first versions of the internet. That's it right there. And where you can, if you have access to the personal computer and you have internet, you have a modem, you can, or a telephone line, you can dial in to these networks and communicate with people all over the world. And so like the WELL is the Whole Earth Wellness Link, the Whole Earth catalog is really significant in that regard. I just want to stress that. So then in 1989, now we've come right up to the point here, early, like at the end of the 80s, Tim Berners-Lee copyrights, patents the WWF of the World Wide Web at CERN. You see, again, this is the European Atomic Energy Research Agency, and this is again so significant because you see that combination of the universities and the research agencies. CERN has developed its own internet system again, because like ARPANET and like the Bell stuff the Bell was working on, and that NASA was developing, and the U.S. Air Force. So like, they've got their own one. And so what you see happening in the 80s and the early 90s is the big deal here, and Tim Berners-Lee was at the forefront of this, is instead of having these regional networks or corporate networks, or university research networks, they're now becoming global networks. It's going up to that global level, and that's a huge transition. That's coinciding with the end of the Cold War. So I can't stress enough how important that is, because now, like the Berlin Wall comes down, you can communicate with people over there, you can communicate with people all over the world, and people who are behind the Iron Curtain are now interested in the technology, and they want to come see what's happening in the West. And so it's really dynamic, and it's all kind of being concentrated in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, and so there's really exciting stuff going on here. 1991, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol is introduced, HTTP. Okay, Linux is released, and it's good. I'm just going to go through this really fast now because in the 90s it's a storm of events, right? So 1993, the Apple Newton is released, first PDA system. Windows NT comes out. The IRC chat is being introduced. 1994, Netscape is founded. GeoCities is released. Okay, Netscape, of course, Jim Clark's company. Like I said, he went from Silicon Graphics to go found Netscape. This is his book, Netscape Time. Now, if you've read Michael Lewis's The New Thing, you'll know the story about Jim Clark and his battle with Microsoft, right? So important, because what you can see there that corporate competition is coming into play now. It's not just about research anymore. It's not just about this kind of like utopian vision from these ex-hippies at the Whole Earth catalog or whatever, just want to communicate with everybody and have like Star Trek. Now it's more about the money is huge, and people want to get a slice of this, and so they're fighting with each other. And obviously, if you've seen the Pirates of Silicon Valley, you know part of that story. Again, with the competition between Apple and Microsoft and IBM, and like I said, all these companies are kind of fighting with each other now. Windows 95 is released, which incorporates Internet Explorer. That's going to destroy Netscape. So Jim Clark eventually sues them. That's in 1997, I believe. At least in 1998, United States versus Microsoft antitrust case, which is so important. You can go on YouTube and you can watch Bill Gates, testifying in that, doing a deposition for like 12 hours in that one. It's quite funny. They were at one time, this is in the book called Barbarians, led by Bill Gates. At one time, Microsoft was being fined $1 million a day for corporate malfeasance for non-compliance with the antitrust regulations. And Bill Gates is on record saying like, oh great, well at that rate, they'll bankrupt us in 1,000 years, whatever. So like, big deal. 1999, Napster comes out. Now in the late 90s, as the internet was starting to boom, one of the key technologies that had to be developed was the modem, right? Because they had, at first you had these like 14 baud and 27 baud, and then you going up to 20 baud up to 56K. So the 56K modem was released in 1997, but at the same time you also had the introduction of DSL and cable. This was getting the speeds up on these internet connections was so crucial, because to get away from this very rudimentary stuff that you could do on the internet, is now being transformed by the introduction of like Netscape and Mozilla and Yahoo and all that, and Napster. These early social networks are starting to come into play. But you needed more capacity, and so the introduction of faster internet connections was really critical there. So then, 2002, Mozilla's released, 2003, MySpace is released, and that sort of ends the story, because you transition now from the computer network internet age to the social network age. And I think that really does represent, I think in 2003, 2004 is a fundamental transition there, because now the experimental phase and like the revolutionary phase is sort of ended, and all the corporations, all the corporate empires that Google, Apple Computers, like I said, Oracle, Sun, all these, right, IBM, Microsoft, etc. Those have all now congealed into these really huge, profitable companies, and that have their platform, their flagship technologies. So Windows, obviously, for like Microsoft. Apple's got the iMac. IBM's still making PCs. Dell, Hewlett Packard. All these companies have now transformed themselves into these computer technology companies at the end of the 90s. And multimedia and the internet are huge, and like things are coming, like VR is coming down the pipe. People can see that's going to be some people are working on that. It's going to develop in the future. So with those, this transition has happened now from the experimental kind of, almost like I said, like utopian kind of, like these guys were like hippies and kind of experimenting with that. But there are also these technologists who wanted to, like I said, went all the way back to '68 and Engelbert English. They wanted to augment human capacity, human capabilities. So some parts of that legacy have not disappeared, certainly, but it's fundamentally transformed by the end of the 90s, because now there's a computer in everybody's home, and everybody can access the internet all around the world. And what people start doing with it is networking individually, which is what the social network is. And so, like I say, MySpace is really the first one of those that kind of becomes popular. And then right after that, Facebook is released. And Microsoft has its MSN network. And like you even see in 1999, the BlackBerry was released. So you see the first like handheld computer PDA that can access the internet, which is going to lead to the smartphone, of course. And that's going to transform all of our lives, as we know. And so I think in a way, you definitely, the vision of the 1968 Mother of All Demos succeeded, because we now can't imagine living without the internet and without access, to an iPhone or your Samsung Galaxy or whatever it is, your smartphone. That has actually augmented our human capability. But it's definitely transformed things in a way that we didn't expect. And so the internet has made it so that instead of just using this, for corporate work or whatever, it's made everybody, a node in these now huge social networks that have billions of users all over the globe, and that I can't imagine, disappearing. And it's not clear where that's going to lead. Some people have said, I think it was, look at Malcolm McLuhan, that what we're seeing now is the end of the cybernetic Stone Age, right? Like, we're still communicating what Apple and Engelbert English, all these guys were looking at in the graphics interface, right, in the computer. But look at the keyboard, right? The keyboard's a QWERTY keyboard. It comes from typewriters, And like the mouse is still kind of an archaic technology. And VR is definitely popular now. It's coming down the pipe more and more. But we're still stuck in this very linear system of communication, and the networks are they have their own capacity problems, and like what Instagram people mainly use to do, they just post pictures of their cats, whatever. So we're not fully utilizing this technology, which in the way that we can, in the way that it should be and will be used in the future. I think once we kind of discover better ways to interface with it. I think that is the bottleneck right now is the interface, but that is clearly changing. I'm not sure if it's going to be AR or VR. I mean, there's been obviously things like Google Glass didn't quite pan out in the past, and like I know Apple is working on their own AR goggles, and I think Google has a new one they're